Richard stood near the edge of the polished mahogany boardroom table, his custom Italian suit feeling like a second skin, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire carefully constructed universe was about to collapse. 2 days ago, he had stood in a muddy parking lot and laughed in his ex-wife's face, pitying her faded jeans, her 10-year-old station wagon, and what he believed was her spectacularly mediocre life. He had patted himself on the back for leaving her behind to climb the corporate ladder. Now, as the double doors of the boardroom swung open to reveal the mysterious billionaire owner of the conglomerate he worked for, Richard's confident smirk melted into absolute, cold-blooded terror. The woman walking into the room was Sarah. The divorce between Richard Sterling and Sarah Jenkins had been finalized 3 years ago, a relatively quiet dissolution of a marriage that had suffocated under the weight of Richard's relentless, blinding ambition. Richard was a man who measured human worth in square footage, horsepower, and job titles. Sarah, conversely, measured it in peace of mind. When they split, Richard had taken the luxury downtown Chicago condo, the sleek Audi, and the aggressive trajectory toward an executive vice presidency at Meridian Holdings, a massive logistics and tech management firm. Sarah had taken her maiden name, a modest settlement she barely negotiated, and her 2014 Subaru Outback. To Richard, he had won the divorce. He had shed dead weight. It was a crisp Sunday morning in late October when their paths crossed for the first time in years. Richard was walking out of an overpriced artisanal bakery in the affluent suburb of Oak Brook, a cup of $5 pour-over coffee in one hand and the manicured hand of his new fiancée, Chloe, in the other. Chloe was 26, an aspiring lifestyle influencer who wore her status anxiety like cheap perfume. As they stepped toward Richard's gleaming new Porsche Panamera, Richard paused. There, loading a 50-pound bag of potting soil into the trunk of a dusty, faded silver Subaru, was Sarah. She was dressed in a worn, oversized Yale hoodie, a remnant from her college days that Richard had always hated, baggy jeans, and mud-caked boots. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, careless bun, and a smudge of dirt streaked across her left cheek. She looked exactly as she had when he left her, unremarkable, unbothered, and entirely unglamorous. A smug, almost predatory grin spread across Richard's face. The contrast between them could not have been more perfectly orchestrated if he had written the scene himself. "Well, if it isn't Sarah," Richard called out, his voice carrying the distinct, carrying pitch of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. Sarah paused, dusting off her gloves, and turned. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed in her pale green eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a serene, impenetrable calm. "Hello, Richard." Chloe leaned into Richard's arm, her perfectly contoured face settling into a mask of polite disdain. "Is this my ex-wife?" Richard supplied, not taking his eyes off Sarah. He gestured expansively, his Rolex catching the morning sun. "Sarah, this is Chloe, my fiancée." "Congratulations," Sarah said simply. Her voice was steady, completely devoid of the jealousy or regret Richard had desperately hoped to hear. She closed the trunk of her Subaru with a heavy metallic clunk. Richard stepped closer, his eyes raking over her muddy boots and the chipped paint on her bumper. "Still driving the old tank, I see. I would have thought you'd have upgraded by now. But then again, you always did like playing it safe. How are things? Still working that middle management desk job at the accounting firm?" Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I left the firm a while ago, actually. I've been branching out, doing some consulting, investing." Richard let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. The idea of Sarah, who used to clip coupons and preferred staying in to read over attending high society galas, navigating the vicious world of investments was genuinely hilarious to him. "Investing?" Richard repeated, tasting the word like a bad wine. "Right. Well, be careful with your settlement money, Sarah. The market isn't for the faint of heart. It takes a certain killer instinct, something you always lacked." He puffed his chest out slightly. "If you need a tip, though, let me know. I was just promoted to Senior Regional Director at Meridian Holdings. We're going through a massive restructuring. Parent company is pumping millions into our division. It's cutthroat right now, but I'm swimming with the sharks." "Meridian Holdings," Sarah repeated softly, her head tilted just a fraction of an inch. "I'm familiar with them." "Of course you are. We own half the supply chain tech in the Midwest," Richard boasted, his ego inflating with every word. He looked around the parking lot, gesturing to the modest gardening supply store next to the bakery. "It's good to see you found your level, though. Potting soil, quiet weekends. It suits you. You never did have the stomach for the big leagues." Chloe giggled, a sharp, silvery sound. "We have to get going, babe. Our brunch reservations at the club are at 11. Sarah didn't flinch. She looked at Richard, then at Chloe, and finally at the gleaming Porsche. Her expression was completely unreadable, a placid lake hiding a terrifying depth. "Enjoy your brunch, Richard," Sarah said, her tone perfectly even. "And congratulations on the promotion, Senior Regional Director. That's quite an achievement. I'm sure your parent company expects great things from you." "They do," Richard said smoothly. "Take care of yourself, Sarah. Try not to get your boots muddy." As Richard and Chloe drove away, the engine of the Porsche roaring with aggressive validation, Richard felt a profound sense of vindication. He had everything. She had nothing. He spent the entire ride to the country club, regaling Chloe with stories of Sarah's lack of drive, her pedestrian tastes, and her sheer, unremarkable mediocrity. He didn't look back to see Sarah pulling a sleek, encrypted satellite phone from the pocket of her faded hoodie, dialing a number, and quietly saying, "Tell the board the audit begins on Monday. I want full access to the Chicago Division's executive files, especially the regional directors." The atmosphere inside the glass and steel monolith of Meridian Holdings was thick with the kind of toxic paranoia that only an impending corporate bloodbath could generate. 2 years prior, Meridian had been quietly acquired by a shadowy, multi-billion-dollar private equity and venture capital firm known as Aegis Vanguard. Aegis was notoriously aggressive, buying up struggling logistics companies, gutting the deadweight, and turning them into highly profitable, hyper-efficient machines. The identity of the firm's founder and majority shareholder was a closely guarded secret in the business world, an elusive figure known only by the moniker The Architect in breathless Forbes articles. Now, Aegis Vanguard was finally turning its eye of Sauron onto Meridian's Chicago headquarters. Rumors were flying like shrapnel. Entire departments were going to be slashed. Vice presidents were going to be forcefully retired. But for a select few who proved their worth, there would be astronomical bonuses and promotions to the global C-suite. Richard Sterling thrived in this environment. To him, chaos was a ladder, and he was more than willing to step on the fingers of his colleagues to climb it. "Did you hear?" whispered Greg Higgins, a fellow regional director whose office was adjacent to Richard's. Greg was a nervous, balding man who sweat through his dress shirts before noon. Almira Caldwell got an email at 4 a.m. The architect is coming in person. Tonight. There's an emergency executive gala at the Drake Hotel to welcome the Aegis Vanguard board, and the restructuring announcements are happening tomorrow morning. Richard barely looked up from his dual monitors. He was busy doctoring a Q3 performance report to heavily imply that a successful merger in Detroit was solely his doing, conveniently erasing Greg's contributions. "Relax, Greg," Richard said, his tone dripping with patronizing calm. "These billionaires are all the same. They want to see confidence. They want to see sharks. If you walk into that gala tonight, sweating like a pig on a spit, you're already fired." "It's easy for you to say," Greg muttered, pacing the plush carpet. "Your numbers are up." "Because I took your accounts?" Richard thought, but simply smiled a predatory, white-toothed smile. "Just wear a dark suit, Greg. Hides the sweat." As Greg scuttled out of the office, Richard leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair and let out a long, satisfied breath. Tonight was his night. He had spent the last 3 weeks preparing an aggressive, cutthroat proposal for the restructuring of the Midwest Division. His plan involved firing 20% of the mid-level workforce, replacing them with automated AI protocols, and consolidating the remaining power into a single vice president of operations role. A role he fully intended to pitch himself for tonight. He picked up his phone and called Chloe. "Babe, cancel whatever you have planned for tonight. Get your makeup done. Wear the black Vera Wang dress I bought you. We are going to the Drake Hotel, and by tomorrow morning, you're going to be sleeping next to the new VP of Meridian." The rest of the day was a blur of electric anticipation. Richard walked the halls of Meridian with the swagger of an executioner sharpening his axe. He brushed past nervous secretaries, ignored the frantic emails from lower-level managers begging for job security, and confidently presented his doctored quarterly reports to the current CEO, Almira Caldwell. Almira, a silver-haired industry veteran who was looking increasingly grey and exhausted by the hour, barely glanced at the papers. "Just be sharp tonight, Richard," Almira said, rubbing his temples, his voice thin and strained. "Aegis Vanguard doesn't play games. I've dealt with their proxies for 2 years, and they are ruthless. They prioritize efficiency over everything. And the founder, I've never met them. No one has. But word is, they despise corporate bloatedness. They despise arrogance. Play it smart." Richard nodded solemnly, internally scoffing. "Despises arrogance? Please. You don't build a $10 billion empire by being humble. You build it by knowing you are the smartest person in the room and crushing anyone who disagrees." Richard knew exactly how to play this. He would show the architect that he was a mirror image of that same ruthless brilliance. At 6 p.m., Richard left the office to go home and change into his custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. As he tied his bow tie in the mirror of his penthouse bathroom, his mind briefly flashed back to Sarah in the muddy parking lot. He chuckled softly to himself, adjusting the silk fabric at his throat. He imagined Sarah sitting in her cramped apartment, eating microwave dinners and watching reality television, completely oblivious to the real power moves happening in the world. She was a peasant, and he was about to be crowned king. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a masterclass in opulent intimidation. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the imported marble floors, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. The room was packed with the top 200 executives of Meridian Holdings, all dressed in their absolute best, clutching champagne flutes like life preservers. The air hummed with nervous, hushed conversations. It felt less like a celebration and more like the deck of the Titanic, with everyone desperately trying to secure a seat on the last lifeboat. Richard navigated the room with the grace of a predatory cat, with Chloe on his arm, looking stunning and appropriately silent. He worked the crowd. He schmoozed with the few Aegis Vanguard proxies he recognized, dropping buzzwords like synergistic streamlining, aggressive downsizing, and capital efficiency. He avoided Greg Higgins, who was practically hyperventilating near the shrimp cocktail tower and positioned himself strategically near the main stage. At exactly 8 p.m., the low hum of classical string music faded. The heavy velvet curtains at the back of the stage twitched. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpets. Almira Caldwell, sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning, stepped up to the acrylic podium. He tapped the microphone, the sharp thud echoing through the cavernous room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Almira began, his voice trembling slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, projecting more authority. "Good evening. For the past 2 years, Meridian Holdings has been under the proud stewardship of Aegis Vanguard. We have seen unprecedented growth, but as we look to the future, we recognize the need for evolution. Tonight, we have the distinct, rare honor of welcoming the architect of our future." Richard stood up straighter, subtly puffing out his chest, making sure he was in the direct line of sight of the stage. He had his brilliant, ruthless pitch locked and loaded in his mind. "This individual built Aegis Vanguard from the ground up," Almira continued, glancing nervously toward the wings of the stage. "A visionary who understands that true power doesn't always need to be loud, to be lethal. Please join me in welcoming the founder and majority shareholder of Aegis Vanguard." Almira stepped back from the podium, his hand extended toward the shadows. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The silence in the ballroom was total. Then, the rhythmic, sharp clack of Christian Louboutin heels echoed from the wings. A figure stepped into the harsh, bright spotlight of the center stage. Richard Sterling was holding a crystal flute filled with expensive vintage champagne. He had a perfectly practiced, confident smile plastered on his face. But as the light hit the face of the billionaire founder of Aegis Vanguard, Richard's brain simply stopped processing reality. The woman standing at the podium was not wearing a faded Yale hoodie. She was not wearing mud-caked boots. She was wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored emerald green Alexander McQueen suit that likely cost more than Richard's car. Her hair, previously a messy bun, was blown out into a sleek, sophisticated cascade. The dirt smudge was gone, replaced by flawless, understated makeup that accentuated her piercing pale green eyes. She looked powerful. She looked terrifying. She looked entirely in control. It was Sarah. Richard's hand went completely numb. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into 100 pieces and splashing cold champagne across the hem of Chloe's dress. A few heads turned at the noise, but Sarah's eyes locked onto the sound immediately. From the stage, she looked down into the crowd. Her gaze swept over the sea of terrified executives until it landed squarely on Richard. For a terrifying, endless moment, the billionaire founder of Aegis Vanguard stared directly at the senior regional director of Meridian Holdings. Sarah didn't look angry. She didn't look smug. She looked at him with the exact same serene, placid expression she had worn in the muddy parking lot 2 days ago. It was the look of a scientist observing an insect trapped under a microscope. "Good evening, everyone," Sarah spoke into the microphone. Her voice was calm, perfectly modulated, and radiated an absolute, unshakable authority that Richard had never, ever heard from her before. It commanded the room instantly. "My name is Sarah Jenkins, and it is time we clean house." Richard couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like syrup in his lungs. His vision tunneled. Jenkins. She had used her maiden name. When he left her, he thought she had taken it back in defeat. She hadn't. She had taken it back to build an empire without his shadow. "Babe!" Chloe whispered frantically, tugging at Richard's sleeve, ignoring the wet champagne on her dress. "Babe, what's wrong? Why are you looking at her like that? Who is that?" Richard opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, choked wheeze escaped. His knees suddenly felt like they were made of water. The room began to spin. The chandeliers, the faces of his colleagues, the emerald green of her suit, all blurring into a nauseating whirlwind of catastrophic realization. Sarah adjusted the microphone slightly, her eyes never leaving Richard's pale, sweat-slicked face. "I have spent the last 48 hours reviewing the personnel files of every executive in this room," Sarah continued, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Some of you have shown incredible innovation. Some of you have shown a commitment to our core values. And some of you—" She paused, and the corners of her lips twitched upward into a microscopic, terrifying smile. "Some of you have prioritized your own arrogance over the health of this company. You have operated under the assumption that ruthlessness is a substitute for competence. Tomorrow morning, there will be a severe restructuring. But before we get to tomorrow," Sarah leaned forward, resting her hands on the podium, "I would like to speak with Richard Sterling in the private boardroom immediately." The entire crowd of 200 executives physically parted, turning to stare at Richard. They stepped away from him as if he were suddenly highly contagious. Even Chloe took a subconscious half-step back. Richard stood completely alone in the center of the shattered glass, his perfectly curated life collapsing around him in real time. He looked up at the stage, at the woman he had dismissed, humiliated, and laughed at. Sarah gave him a slight, polite nod, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. "Don't keep me waiting, Richard," she said softly into the microphone. "I hear you're a very busy man." The walk from the center of the grand ballroom to the private oak-paneled boardroom at the rear of the Drake Hotel felt to Richard like a march to the gallows. The heavy, suffocating silence of 200 of his peers pressing against his back was a physical weight. Every step was agonizingly slow. His custom Tom Ford tuxedo, which had felt like a suit of armor an hour ago, now felt like a straitjacket. He pushed open the heavy double doors. The room was dimly lit, save for the low-hanging amber lamps illuminating a massive, polished mahogany table. At the far end of the table sat Sarah. She wasn't alone. Flanking her were two individuals who radiated an aura of lethal, quiet corporate violence. On her right was a severe-looking man in a slate-grey suit, meticulously reviewing a stack of physical documents. On her left was a woman with sharp features, tapping away at a sleek, matte black laptop. Sarah gestured gracefully to the single empty leather chair positioned directly across the length of the table from her. "Have a seat, Richard." Richard's throat was bone dry. He gripped the back of the chair, his knuckles turning white, but he didn't sit immediately. He forced a strained, desperate chuckle, attempting to summon the ghost of his usual bravado. "Sarah, come on," Richard started, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat to lower the pitch. This is an incredible prank. A hell of a show out there. You bought Aegis Vanguard. Congratulations are in order, obviously. We have a lot to catch up on. But you don't need to do this whole intimidating theatrics thing with me. We're old friends. We were married, Richard. We were never friends, Sarah replied, her voice entirely devoid of malice, which somehow made it significantly more terrifying. And I did not buy Aegis Vanguard. I founded it. 7 years ago, while you were busy complaining that my job at the accounting firm wasn't prestigious enough for your dinner parties, I was quietly securing initial capital from a private equity contact to buy out failing mid-market supply chains. But we aren't here to discuss my resume. She nodded to the man on her right. This is Harrison Cole, Chief Legal Officer for Aegis Vanguard. And this is Madeline Sterling. No relation to you, fortunately. Our lead forensic auditor from the Deloitte account. Have a seat." It was a command, not a request. Richard sat. Sarah folded her hands on the table. 2 days ago, in a parking lot in Oak Brook, you were kind enough to offer me investment advice. You mentioned you were swimming with sharks. You also mentioned a massive restructuring happening here at Meridian. "Sarah, I was just showing off," Richard pleaded, leaning forward, suddenly desperate to humanize himself. "You know how I get. It was my ego talking. You caught me off guard with my new fiancé, and I overcompensated. I'm sorry if I insulted you, but my work at this company speaks for itself. I've doubled the revenue in the Midwest sector." "Have you?" Sarah asked softly. She nodded at Madeline, who pressed a button on her laptop. A large flat-screen monitor on the wall behind Sarah blinked to life, displaying a complex web of spreadsheets, Salesforce data dumps, and internal email transcripts. "We executed a localized deep-dive audit of the Chicago executive branch starting at 9 a.m. on Monday," Sarah explained, her eyes locking onto Richard's. "I specifically requested a review of your much-boasted Detroit merger. The one you submitted a Q3 performance report for this afternoon to Almira Caldwell." Richard's stomach plummeted into a bottomless, freezing abyss. "You see, Richard," Sarah continued, her tone conversational, like a professor explaining a rudimentary concept to a slow student. "Aegis Vanguard doesn't just look at bottom-line revenue. We look at operational integrity. Madeline, what did we find in Mr. Sterling's Q3 report?" Madeline didn't even look up from her screen as she spoke in a clipped, professional monotone. Mr. Sterling claimed sole executive oversight of the Detroit logistics integration. However, internal Slack communications, time-stamped server logs, and vendor contracts clearly show that 92% of the groundwork, client retention, and system onboarding was executed by Gregory Higgins and his subordinate team. Mr. Sterling utilized his senior clearance to retroactively alter the authorship of the final proposal documents before submission to the C-suite. "He stole the credit," Harrison Cole added bluntly, leaning back in his chair. "Blatant corporate plagiarism." "Greg is a mess," Richard exploded, panic overriding his instinct to grovel. "He's weak. He can't close a deal to save his life. I managed the macro-level strategy. I was the face of the merger. That's how this industry works, Sarah, and you know it. You don't get to the top by being a Boy Scout. I secured the capital." "You didn't secure anything," Sarah corrected, her voice finally dropping a fraction of an octave, chilling the room. "You cannibalized your own colleague to inflate your apparent value before a restructuring you knew was coming. You created an illusion of competence, just like you've always done." She slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood. It stopped exactly inches from Richard's hands. "But taking credit for Greg's work is just a symptom of a larger disease. Richard, open the folder." Trembling, Richard flipped the cover open. Inside were copies of expense reports, corporate credit card statements, and vendor invoices. "Over the last 18 months, you have expensed over $80,000 in client entertainment to a shell consulting firm called Apex Dynamics," Sarah stated. "A firm that, upon very light probing by our friends at Deloitte, turns out to be registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, managed by your college fraternity brother, Michael Vance." Richard felt the blood drain entirely from his face. He couldn't speak. His tongue felt like a dry sponge. "You've been siphoning corporate funds to subsidize your luxury lifestyle, Richard," Harrison Cole said, his voice laced with disgust. "Using a fake vendor to pad your own pockets so you could afford the lease on that Gold Coast penthouse and the payments on your fiancée's ring. It was a retainer, Richard stammered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. They provided market research. Don't insult my intelligence, Sarah cut him off, her green eyes flashing with a sudden, intense sharpness. It's embezzlement, fraud, pure and simple. You thought because Meridian was a bloated corporate entity under Almira Caldwell, no one would look closely at the mid-level executive expenses. But Aegis Vanguard looks at everything. Sarah leaned back, resting her chin on her steepled fingers. When I ran into you on Sunday, I honestly didn't care about you, Richard. You were a closed chapter, a mistake I learned from. But when you bragged to my face about the company I built, when you stood there dripping in arrogance, funded by stolen money, I decided to take a closer look under your hood. She let the silence hang for a moment, letting the absolute destruction of his reality sink in. Your engine is rotting, Richard. What happens now? Richard whispered. The imposing, aggressive senior regional director was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell of a man. Harrison Cole opened a black leather portfolio and produced a single, crisp sheet of paper. He slid it across the table, placing it on top of the fraudulent expense reports. This is your formal notice of termination, effective immediately, Harrison said. You are being fired for gross misconduct and violation of fiduciary duty. Because you are being terminated for cause, your severance package is voided. Your unvested stock options are cancelled. Your 401k matching contributions from the company for the last 3 years are under review for clawback. You're taking everything, Richard gasped, staring at the termination letter as if it were a venomous snake. I'm not taking anything. You forfeited it, Sarah replied evenly. Furthermore, the Porsche Panamera you drove to the country club on Sunday? I checked the corporate fleet registry. It's a company-leased vehicle provided under the Executive Transportation Allowance, an allowance you no longer qualify for. Madeline finally looked up from her laptop, a small, grim smile on her face. Security is currently at the Drake Hotel Valet. They have already taken possession of the keys. Your personal items from your office will be boxed and couriered to your home address by tomorrow afternoon. You are barred from entering any Meridian Holdings property. Richard felt a tear of pure, unadulterated panic prick the corner of his eye. Sarah, please, if you fire me for cause, if you put fraud on my record, I'll never work in this industry again. I'll lose the condo. The mortgage is... He stopped himself, realizing he was admitting his financial house of cards to the woman he had spent years belittling for being poor. The mortgage is deeply underwater because you leveraged yourself to the hilt to look rich, Sarah finished for him, her voice lacking any pity. You spent your life obsessing over the appearance of wealth, Richard, while I spent mine building actual wealth. You thought my Subaru was a sign of failure. It was a sign that I didn't need to perform my success for anyone. I was comfortable in my own skin. You are so terrified of being perceived as ordinary that you committed a felony to avoid it. She stood up, buttoning the jacket of her Emerald McQueen suit. The meeting was over. Harrison will walk you through the non-disclosure agreements regarding the embezzlement, Sarah said, looking down at him one last time. If you sign them, and if you quietly walk away tonight, Aegis Vanguard will decline to press criminal charges. We prefer to keep our restructuring out of the public courts. Consider it a parting gift for the years I wasted married to you. Richard sat paralyzed, the pen Harrison offered him hovering over the termination paperwork. His hand shook so violently he could barely grip the silver barrel. He signed his name, the signature a jagged, ugly scrawl. "Stand up, Mr. Sterling," Harrison commanded, gently but firmly. I need your corporate keycard, your corporate cell phone, and your company credit cards. Now." Numbly, Richard reached into his tailored jacket. He placed the heavy platinum cards, the sleek smartphone, and his ID badge on the table. Without them, he felt entirely naked. "You may leave through the service elevator at the back of the hall," Sarah said, turning her back to him to look at the data on the wall monitor. "I have a gala to return to. I believe I have a promotion to offer Gregory Higgins." Richard stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He didn't say another word. There were no words left. He turned and practically fled from the boardroom, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him with a terrifying finality. He didn't take the service elevator. Blinded by shock and a desperate, clinging need for familiarity, he walked back out into the grand ballroom. The gala was still in full swing, though the energy had shifted to a frenetic, nervous buzz. As Richard walked through the crowd, people actively stepped out of his way. The news of his public summoning had already branded him with the mark of death. No one made eye contact. He found Chloe standing near the ice sculpture, her arms crossed tight across her chest, her face pale. "Richard!" she hissed as he approached, dragging him by the elbow into a relatively quiet alcove near the velvet curtains. "What happened? People are whispering. Someone said that woman on stage, the billionaire. Someone said that's your ex-wife. Are they insane?" "It's true," Richard croaked, his voice barely functioning. He leaned heavily against the marble wall, feeling physically sick. "It's her. She owns the company, Chloe. She owns everything." Chloe stared at him, her perfectly glossed lips parting in horror. Okay, but that's a good thing, right? You guys were married. You have history. You can leverage that. Did she promote you to the global board?" Richard let out a hollow, agonizing laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Promote me? Chloe, she just destroyed me. I'm fired. I'm terminated for gross misconduct." The color rapidly drained from Chloe's face. "Fired? What does that mean? What about your bonus? The restructuring?" "There is no bonus," Richard said, sliding down the wall slightly, his custom tuxedo wrinkling. "I lose the stock. I lose the severance. They took the company phone. They even took the Porsche, Chloe. Security has the keys at the valet." Chloe physically recoiled from him, taking a distinct step back. Her eyes darted around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of the executives glancing in their direction. The supportive arm candy persona vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by cold, calculating self-preservation. "The Porsche is gone?" she asked, her voice tight and high-pitched. "Richard, how are we supposed to get home? To the condo?" "We'll have to call an Uber," Richard muttered, pulling out his personal, older model phone. "And the mortgage?" Chloe pressed, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "You told me the condo was paid off. You told me the ring was a cash purchase." Richard looked away, unable to meet her furious gaze. I financed it. I was banking on the VP promotion to clear the debt. It was a sure thing, Chloe." Chloe stared at him, really looking at him for perhaps the first time. She didn't see the confident, high-rolling executive she had latched onto. She saw a fraud, a bankrupt man in a borrowed suit standing in the wreckage of his own hubris. "Call an Uber for yourself, Richard," Chloe said, her voice dripping with the exact same disdain Richard had used on Sarah just 2 days prior. Before Richard could respond, Chloe turned on her Louboutin heels. She didn't look back as she walked briskly toward the front entrance of the Drake Hotel, pulling her phone from her clutch to text a friend, instantly distancing herself from the sinking ship. Richard stood alone in the alcove. The classical string quartet started up again, a lively, upbeat Vivaldi piece that mocked the absolute devastation of his life. Through the crowd, the sea of executives parted once more. Sarah Jenkins walked back into the ballroom. She wasn't looking for him. She didn't even glance in his direction. She walked with quiet, devastating power toward a terrified, sweating Greg Higgins, extending a hand to the man whose career Richard had tried to steal. Richard watched as Greg shook her hand, practically weeping with relief. He had nothing left. The illusion was shattered. As Richard slowly turned and pushed through the heavy service doors to find the alleyway exit, the cold Chicago wind hit him in the face. A brutal, unforgiving reminder of exactly where he now stood in the world. The morning after the Drake Hotel Gala, Richard Sterling woke up on the beige, faux leather sofa of a mid-tier Courtyard Marriott in Evanston. The transition from a custom-tailored life to this sterile, smell-of-stale coffee room had taken less than 12 hours. His phone, an old, cracked iPhone 11 he had dug out of a storage box because his sleek corporate model had been confiscated, was buzzing violently against the cheap laminate nightstand. It was a debt collector for the Gold Coast condo. Richard ignored it. He sat up, his head pounding with a visceral, sickening ache that had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with the total collapse of his reality. He had spent the early hours of the morning desperately logging into his banking portals. The reality was much worse than he had ever admitted to Chloe, or even to himself. His checking account held exactly $4,120. His credit cards were maxed out from the fake client entertainment dinners, the first-class flights to Cabo, and the flawless 3-carat cushion-cut diamond ring Chloe had undoubtedly already taken to a pawn shop. His massive impending bonus from the Meridian restructuring was supposed to act as a dam against the flood of debt. Now, the dam had evaporated. By Tuesday, the corporate whispers had transformed into industry-wide shouts. Aegis Vanguard's restructuring of Meridian Holdings made the front page of the Wall Street Journal's business section. The article praised the ruthless efficiency of the elusive founder, Sarah Jenkins, and detailed the surgical removal of bloated, corrupt middle management. Richard's name wasn't explicitly printed, but in the incestuous, fast-talking world of Chicago logistics and corporate finance, it didn't need to be. When he attempted to call a recruiter at Cushman and Wakefield, a contact he had schmoozed just a month prior, the assistant politely but firmly told him the executive roster was full. A desperate cold call to a VP at Bain & Company ended with a dial tone the second Richard stated his name. He was radioactive. He carried the stench of an Aegis Vanguard purge, compounded by the silent, industry-understood rumor of financial misconduct. Desperation breeds severe delusions. Trapped in his fading illusion of grandeur, Richard refused to apply for mid-level managerial roles. He was a senior regional director, he told himself. He just needed capital to buy time. 2 weeks into his exile, staring at a foreclosure notice taped to the door of his empty penthouse, Richard made a fatal, arrogant pivot. He liquidated the last remaining $15,000 from a forgotten, high-risk mutual fund he had opened years ago. Instead of using it to secure a modest apartment and pay his baseline bills, he deposited it directly into a volatile retail brokerage account. He was going to day trade his way back to the top. He was going to prove he had the killer instinct. Richard spent manic, sleepless nights analyzing market trends, ignoring the basic fundamental rules of economic stability. He noticed a slight dip in global commodities leading up to the holiday season. Certain that the market was overreacting to international trade murmurs, he placed massive, highly leveraged short positions on gold futures, betting his entire remaining net worth that the price of gold would plummet immediately following the new year. It was a reckless, ego-driven gamble. He didn't know that Aegis Vanguard had just acquired a massive stake in a green tech mining operation in Nevada, signaling a massive corporate shift toward physical asset backing. In the second week of January, global inflation reports hit the wire alongside Aegis Vanguard's aggressive new commodities strategy. The market panicked in the opposite direction. Investors flocked to safe havens. The price of gold didn't just rise, it violently spiked, breaking historical resistance levels in a matter of 48 hours. Richard watched the flickering red numbers on his laptop screen in a dingy, month-to-month studio apartment in Skokie. His margin call hit at 2:14 p.m. on a Thursday. The broker automatically liquidated his account to cover the staggering losses. The $15,000 vanished into the digital ether, completely wiped out by the exact market forces he arrogantly believed he could outsmart. The screen refreshed, showing an account balance of minus $342.10. He wasn't just broke. He was broken. The man who had mocked his ex-wife for buying potting soil and driving a 10-year-old Subaru now couldn't afford a bag of groceries. The corporate shark had drowned in a puddle of his own making. 3 years had passed since the catastrophic margin call evaporated Richard Sterling's final shred of financial dignity. The crushing weight of his new reality had aged him a decade. The air inside the massive fulfillment center in Gary, Indiana, always smelled of damp cardboard dust and cheap diesel exhaust. Richard wore a stiff, neon yellow safety vest over a faded gray t-shirt. His custom Italian suits had all been liquidated to pay off aggressive legal retainers and compounding debt. His hair, once impeccably styled, was now thinning and threaded with stark white. He was currently employed as a Tier 1 inventory associate for a struggling logistics supplier called Apex Industrial. The title was a polite fiction for a job requiring a complete suspension of pride. His routine consisted of walking up and down towering steel racks, manually scanning barcodes on heavy pallets with a buggy handheld device. To Richard, who once orchestrated multi-million-dollar corporate mergers over rare stakes, the irony was physically painful. He spent his days fixing database errors and realigning boxes of bolts for $19 an hour. His hands, once manicured, were calloused and stained with machine grease. Every morning, he woke up in a cramped studio apartment, joints aching, only to ride a public bus to a job where his manager, a kid named Brody, openly mocked his slow pace. On a bitterly cold Tuesday morning, a frantic energy infected the warehouse floor. It was the terrified buzz of impending corporate upheaval. "Sterling, pick up the pace!" Brody barked, chewing nicotine gum, his clipboard shaking. "We got a massive VIP walkthrough in Sector 4 at 1100 hours. Top-tier corporate suits. Word is they're looking to acquire the entire Apex distribution network." Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Acquire us? Who?" Brody scoffed. "Some holding company out of Chicago. They're going to gut our manual tracking systems and implement their proprietary AI technology. Automated digital logistics, predictive algorithms, the works. They want to see if our floor plan is worth salvaging before they fire half the management and let AI run the routing." A familiar dread pooled in Richard's stomach. Did they give a company name? "Aegis Vanguard," Brody snapped. "Now get the push broom. I want every stray bolt off this concrete before the CEO walks through those bay doors. If you screw this up, you're back on the street by noon." Richard stood perfectly still. Aegis Vanguard. The name echoed like a death knell. He had spent 3 years trying to bury the memory of that emerald green suit and the absolute destruction of his life. He had convinced himself he could hide in these industrial gutters, entirely forgotten. At exactly 11 a.m., the primary loading dock doors rolled upward with a deafening screech. A convoy of 4 pristine, heavily tinted SUVs rolled directly onto the concrete floor, their engines purring with quiet menace. Richard aggressively swept the far end of Sector 4, keeping his head down. He pulled the brim of his faded cap low, praying to simply blend into the dusty background. He was just a ghost in a yellow vest. The doors of the lead SUV opened. The entourage that stepped out was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. Sharp lawyers carrying briefcases, data analysts holding tablets, and the sweating, pale-faced executives of Apex Industrial, looking like men walking to their executions. And then she stepped onto the floor. Sarah Jenkins didn't look like the woman he had married, nor the terrifying billionaire who had dismantled him. She looked like an empire personified. Dressed in an understated charcoal cashmere coat, dark slacks, and bespoke leather boots, she radiated absolute control. She was a global titan. As the group moved down the central aisle, their voices carried. As you can see, Ms. Jenkins, our Midwest distribution footprint remains incredibly robust, the Apex CEO stammered, practically jogging to keep pace. But we lack the digital infrastructure to optimize the regional routes. That's exactly where your AI integration would revolutionize our output. The physical footprint is acceptable, Sarah replied. Her voice, calm, perfectly modulated, and chillingly familiar, sent a physical shockwave down Richard's spine. But your floor-level efficiency is hemorrhaging capital. Your routing software is archaic, and your reliance on manual inventory verification is a liability. We will gut the middle management tier entirely and implement the Aegis Vanguard automated protocols within 60 days. I don't want human error slowing down data that an algorithm can process flawlessly. They were getting closer. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He kneeled near a bottom-tier storage rack, pretending to meticulously realign a heavy 50-pound cardboard box of industrial steel brackets. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the cardboard. "Just walk past," he silently begged, eyes glued to his scuffed, steel-toed boots. But the entourage stopped directly adjacent to aisle 44. Sarah was pointing toward the overhead lighting grid, quietly discussing the installation of automated drone scanners with her lead engineer. Richard's trembling hands betrayed him. The heavy box slipped from his slick grip. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp, echoing crack, splitting the bottom seam and spilling dozens of heavy steel brackets across the aisle, directly into the path of the executives. The group went dead silent. Brody turned violent red. "Sterling, you clumsy idiot! Clean that up immediately!" Richard slowly, agonizingly, stood up. The bright safety vest felt like a flashing beacon of his ultimate failure. He had nowhere to run. Slowly, he lifted his head, pushing the brim of his cap back. Standing less than 10 feet away, flanked by a team of the most powerful corporate lawyers in the hemisphere, was Sarah Jenkins. For 3 breathless seconds, time simply ceased to exist. Richard felt his face flush with a shame so profound it threatened to crush his lungs. He was standing in the dirt, holding a broken broom, earning minimum wage at a failing company his ex-wife was currently casually consuming before lunch. The universe had delivered its final, perfect punchline. He waited for the smirk. He braced himself for the vindictive display of dominance. He expected her to point him out, to loudly mock his dirty clothes and pathetic position, just as he had laughed in her face in that muddy parking lot. He waited for the crushing weight of her revenge. But Sarah did not smile. She did not gloat. Her pale green eyes shifted from the spilled brackets up to the broken man in the yellow vest. She looked at him with the exact same serene, placid, terrifyingly calm expression she had always possessed. She looked at him, not as an enemy, not as a former husband, and not as a conquered rival. She looked at him exactly as if he were a piece of broken warehouse equipment. "Please be careful with the physical inventory, associate," Sarah said quietly. Her tone was perfectly polite, professionally detached, and completely, utterly devoid of any recognition. "We are evaluating the tangible assets today." She didn't pause for a response. She didn't offer a second glance. Sarah turned her head back to the sweating Apex CEO, seamlessly resuming her lecture on the digital content strategy for supply chain transparency, and walked past Richard. Her entourage flowed around him like a river, bypassing an insignificant stone. Richard stood alone in the dusty aisle, his hands hanging limply. In that agonizingly quiet moment, he finally understood the most brutal truth. The opposite of love wasn't hate. The opposite of respect wasn't mockery. The opposite of respect was absolute, profound indifference. Sarah hadn't just beaten him. She had entirely outgrown his existence. He wasn't even a footnote in her reality anymore. As the heavy corrugated steel doors of the warehouse bay clicked shut behind the billionaires, sealing him back inside his prison of boxes and dust, Richard dropped to his knees, began picking up the brackets one by one, and wept. Richard Sterling's spectacular downfall serves as a brutal testament to the dangers of vanity and the hollow nature of performative success. He spent his life constructing a fragile empire out of stolen credit, maxed-out credit cards, and arrogant cruelty, mistaking a custom suit for actual character. In his desperate scramble to look down on others, he completely blinded himself to the quiet, methodical rise of true power. Sarah Jenkins, in stark contrast, proved that genuine wealth and unstoppable authority do not require an audience or a loud introduction. They are forged in silence, patience, and unyielding competence. The ultimate karma was not found in a screaming match or a vindictive display of revenge, but in the devastating quiet of total indifference. In the end, Richard learned the hardest lesson of all. Those who laugh at the simplicity of the foundation are always the first to be crushed when the building inevitably collapses.